And we are recording. Start with the announcements and reminders. Another weekend. I took the weekend off for the most part, so I have a lot of catching up to do. Just to let you know, usually that doesn't even affect you guys, but there's at least 2 students with my online classes who watch these lectures. So in a way, it's kind of for them. But yeah, I have a lot of catching up to do. It might be a while, maybe today, or excuse me, tomorrow or Wednesday, before I'm caught up with everything that was turned in over the weekend. And also, not that it matters to you guys, but just in case you're curious, because that might not make much sense to you, since everything you have is due on Friday, and we don't have that large of a class. But I have a lot of other students, a lot of online students, and everything they do is always due on Sundays. So discussions, labs, quizzes, exams. So Mondays are very busy for me, just to let you know. Anyway, that's that. Exam 3, as we decided, and as I mentioned last Friday, will be this coming Friday. So make sure you're here on time. Actually, that's one of those times it doesn't matter if you're late, because if you're late, it's only hurting yourself. Because the exam will end at 8:50, regardless of what time you started. So on a related note, I'm usually here about 7:20. So if you'd like to come in early, so you have more time to do it, I'm okay with that. And again, if you don't want to take it this Friday, you prefer to take it some other time, if we can make some sort of arrangements to meet online to where I can proctor your exam, then you don't have to take it this Friday. On a related note, let me skip one. This week's lab is just watching a video. You're just going to watch a documentary, answer some questions about it. That's it. So we're not going to meet in person. It's 100% virtual. The due date's still Friday. But since we're not doing this week's lab online, if you want to, that would be a perfect time. I would be glad. I have nothing else. Well, I have other stuff to do. But anyway, I will gladly be here at this desk Wednesday at 9 a.m. if you want to take the test at that point, right? So once again, you would have more time because the lab period is a lot longer than the regular lecture. So feel free to come in on Wednesday, or let me know beforehand, because if no one's going to be here, I'm also not going to be here. So, but yeah, if you want to take the exam on Wednesday instead and have that much longer time period to take it, I am okay with that. So any questions about this exam 3? Okay, so going back, just to remind you, since exam 3 is going to be on Friday, that means exam 2, the retake, must be done by Friday. To remind you, you can retake it as many times as you want, even if you already have. Feel free to do that. But yeah, Friday will be the last day you can redo that exam to change the grade. You can always redo it, just like exam 1, just for the practice of it. And just like exam 1, once it closes for the retake, I can meet you online, give you all the correct answers to the questions, talk about why these are the correct answers and those are the incorrect answers, and give you a 5% boost to that grade. So any questions about exams in general? All right, then we'll just do the regular participation announcement stuff. I'm gonna say a bunch of attendance words. You guys in person are gonna write them down. Well, everybody should write them down. But if you're online right now, streaming or watching a video at a later date, also take a screenshot when I say one of them. At the end of it, you're going to see me an email with a list of attendance words with the screenshots, one question about the material, and then if you were watching the video, so obviously not if you're streaming or in person, also like or comment on the video, take a screenshot of that and include it. So any questions about any of this? All right. Let's do the first attendance word then. It is, there we go. Bear with me, I apologize. Thomas Jefferson, because today is his birthday. And obviously he's the founding father, so that's kind of a big deal. But he was quite a scientist. So I'm going to throw that out. Just really quickly do attendance, then we'll move forward. If you're online and I say your name and say you're not here, don't worry about it. You know, this is just for the people who are physically here. Ashley is here, Barrett is here, Trahan is here, Dickens not here, Inca is here, Isaiah is not here, Haley is not here, Lucas is not here, Marley is not here, Noah is not here, Savannah is not here, Leah is here, bless you, Edwards is not here, Wilkes is not here. Did I miss anybody? It's Monday, huh? Hell yeah. I really did not feel like coming in today. Long night last night. Anyway, this is where we left off talking about, right? We were talking about, before we even got into evolution, we're talking about the diversity of life and classifying the diversity of life. So what we're really talking about is taxonomy, basically. And to remind you, this PowerPoint is based off the old textbook, so it's definitely out of order from your textbook. For example, right now we're talking about chapter 12 stuff, and then we're about to move into chapter 11 stuff. Oh, it's a good time for me to remind you. Because no one's asked this. We went from chapter 9, which is the last portion of exam 3, and jumped to chapter 11. So yes, we did skip chapter 10. There'll be no questions about chapter 10 on the exam. It's just about, well, you can read it if you want, but don't worry about chapter 10. Anyway, you do need to know this. You need to know this this list. And actually, let me just show you on the other side. I think the other side will give it to you in a better way. Right? We start very specific and get broad, or you can start very broad and get specific, but you should know this backward and forward. Now, obviously, you don't need to know these examples. So you do need to know the most broad category is domain, and then we have 2 kingdoms in there, and then some phylums in there, class, order, family, genus, species. You need to know it in that order. What you don't need to know is this example, right? Eukarya, Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia. Right? You don't need to know all that. Those are just examples. The point is, you need to know that in order. You might get a question where you need to know it from most specific to broad, or broad to most specific. You might get a question where you just have a list of these and they're all incorrect because some of them are slightly out of order, but then one of them will be correct, or it might be vice. Yeah, that'll be the way it is probably. A bunch of incorrect ones and then one that is correct. And again, I might give you something like this and say, if this were the example, and if I did use this example and give you Panthera pardus, I could give you the entire thing in this order, right? So I could say, here, let me ask you a question about this Panthera pardus, and then give you the family name in this order, right? I'll give you the family name, the order name, the class name, but it won't say family Felidae, order Carnivora. It'll just say Panthera pardus, Panthera pardus, Felidae, Carnivora, Mammalia, so on and so forth. Anyway, I'll give that list, and then I'll say what phylum is it is, or excuse me, what phylum is it in? And then from there, you have to think, okay, well, Panthera pardus is the species, so therefore that must be the genus, that must be the family, that must be the order, that must be the class, so on, that must be the phylum. So you will get a question like that, right? Give you the whole list of what an organism is, and then I'll ask you, hey, what class is it in? What kingdom is it in? What family is it in? So any questions about that? Okay, this picture I think is from the old textbook. This picture is from a completely different textbook, the third textbook, but again, same way of looking, or a different way of looking at the same thing. Here we're more broad, right? The domain Eukarya, which is what we are, and there's prokaryotes and archaea, but we don't worry about that. Anyway, very, very broad down to very specific. So any questions about this? All right, as I mentioned earlier on Friday when we first started talking about this, ultimately the criteria to determine, how these things are grouped, like, all right, which species are going to be in this genus, which species are going to be in that genus. Okay, good. Now, which family is this genus going to be in, this one or that, right? At first, when Linnaeus first started doing this, it was pretty arbitrary. It was mostly based on, the way something looked, like its structures, or perhaps the way it reproduced, things like that. But now, as we're getting a little bit better with technology, it's becoming a little bit less arbitrary and more based on genes. We can tell how things are related by looking at their genomes. But anyway, so again, this is out of order. This is chapter 12 in your textbook, but in the old textbook, this is the beginning of the evolution chapter. And I think it really should be, because it's like, hey, here's the diversity of life. And now that you know the diversity of life, let's talk about how we got there, which is evolution. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this little taxonomy video right here. See? If you click on that, that's a link that'll take you to it. So anyway, any questions about this slide? Okay, let's define what a species is. You need to know what a species is for the exam as well. It's a group of actually or potentially interbreeding individuals. Yeah, and then also the second bullet point is also important to the definition. One species is distinguished from another by the possibility of the mating between individuals from each species to produce fertile offspring. So for example, a lion and a tiger, those are two different species. But if they interbreed, they will produce offspring, a liger, but the liger is not fertile. Same with a donkey and a horse, right? If you breed them together, they will produce offspring, very healthy offspring, as a matter of fact. And that's a mule, but the mule is also infertile. So again, a species, it's the same group, right? They have to be able to interbreed to create fertile offspring. Don't confuse species with population. We'll talk about that later. But population is almost like, again, we'll get there later in more detail, but for now, I'll just say population, you can almost consider that like, if we're considering a species, one species might have different populations. So we'll come back to that. Anyway, so this is basically the rule of what a species is. You need to know it. There are exceptions. You don't need to know that there are exceptions or what the exceptions are. You can look those up, right? What are the exceptions when you have two different species interbreed and produce a fertile offspring? But yeah, as far as we're concerned, that's how we distinguish it. So any questions about this slide or the definition of species? All right. You guys sound tired. Anyway, let's talk about speciation. Like, how do we get species? This is what we're going to talk about. This is very important for the exam and for understanding evolution. I will point out, too, that usually when people talk about evolution, I think, this is an opinion, but it seems to me when people talk about evolution, this is usually what they're talking about. So I like that we talk about this right out the gate. But just so you know, evolution is not always the creation of a new species, as you should already know from the labs that we did, right? So that first lab with the moth, that was with the same species, right? Whether it was dark, light, or somewhere in between, that was the same species. We just changed the percentage. We just happened to have more darker moths towards the end. Then we did the Hardy-Weinberg thing, right, with those fish. Those fish just stayed the same species. There was just 3 different phenotypes, orange, white, and then spotted. It just so happens that the percentage changed throughout the experiments. So anyway, speciation. There's 2 different types. You're going to need to know the difference between allopatric and sympatric. Allopatric speciation involves a geographic separation of populations. Yeah, we'll just leave it at that. Let me see, it's the next slide. Yeah, I'll give you an example of allopatric on the next slide. And then we'll talk about sympatric speciation after that, which is speciation within a parent species while remaining in one location. So basically, we're talking about speciation 1 because the original, the group of that species, they got split up due to geographic reasons, and the other one, they're not split up. That's all that means. And even though we're going to get a little bit deeper than that in this discussion for the exam, that's basically all you need to know, right? Allopatric, they got separated and therefore changed in different directions. And then sympatric, where they're not separated. Let's talk about it. Here's a picture not from your textbook. This is a great example. Imagine there's a tree. Oh, it's really hard to see. I wish you could see my screen. Maybe you can. Yeah. Anyway, that's a map of the Pacific Northwest. Right? There's the Puget Sound, there's Washington, there's Vancouver up there. Anyway, there's a huge mountain range right there. But imagine back in the day, before that mountain range formed, because the way that mountain range formed, not that you need to know any of this, there's this plate in the Pacific Ocean, which is what's drawn right here, and it hit the North American plate, hit the North American plate, and it literally just crushed the land and pushed up these mountains. So these mountains have not always been there. Getting back to my point of speciation, imagine there was some species of plant or tree, and it took over this whole, it lived all over Washington, right? All over Washington. But then this happens. So now this one species is now separated. You have some on this side and some on this side of the mountain range. Now, does anybody know anything about Seattle? Like, when do you think of Seattle and weather? What do you guys think of? I don't know if you even know.
Rain.
Rain. Good. That is correct. It is very rainy. The reason it's so rainy is you have all this weather coming in from the Pacific Ocean with all, so it's very hot, or humid. It has a lot of moisture, and it hits this mountain ranges and tries to go up. And it really, for the most part, can't make it over the mountains. So what happens is it just dumps all that rain. The atmosphere dumps the rain. So it's really rainy in Seattle on that side of the mountains. And it's basically a desert on the other side. So again, imagine you have this one species of tree Then you have these mountains come up. Now these trees are separated, hence the allopatric speciation. And then they're going to change, right? Because they have two completely different climates now. One's getting a lot of rain, one's getting barely any rain. So, eventually they're going to change and evolve to be suited for those environments. And those are such different environments that they're probably going to lead to different species. Yeah, that was just an example. You don't need to know that. Again, for the example or for the exam, you just need to know allopatric speciation. We're talking about separate when a species gets separated. So any questions about that? All right, adaptive radiation. This is where the population of one species disperses throughout an area. So in a sense, adaptive radiation is kind of like a subcategory of allopatric speciation. So we're still talking about the species being separated from each other in different environments. And again, different environments lead to different species, or can lead to different species, because different types of organisms of that species are going to thrive in different environments based on evolution. So anyway, this is still allopatric speciation, but again, this is just because it's where they've spread, right? So it isn't as if they got separated by a mountain range, or sometimes continents will dissipate, right? They'll separate from each other, right? That would be another example of what I talked about last time. But when it's adaptive radiation, it's not like that. It's just them migrating, basically. Yeah. So any questions about that? All right. The next word for attendance is going to be peach cobbler. Today is Peach Cobbler Day, National Peach Cobbler Day. Fresh credit, you can look into peaches. What is their scientific name? Have they always looked like they look now, or was that due to artificial selection? Let me see what that was. Make sure we're still recording. Yeah, you are. Okay. Anyway, any questions about that? Okay, move back into it then. So then there's sympatric speciation. So again, we're done talking about allopatric speciation. We're not talking about organisms that have been separated from each other. We're talking about sympatric speciation. They're still in the same area. A lot of times this happens due to chromosomal error during meiosis, or the formation of a hybrid individual that has too many chromosomes. So as we already know, largely, especially with humans, as one example, right? When having the not the right amount of chromosomes is usually a bad thing. And we talked about polyploidy and aneuploidy. Remember, aneuploidy just means you don't have the right number of chromosomes. Then we specifically talked about polyploidy, which means you have too many chromosomes. And again, generally that's a bad thing, especially with more advanced animals, including humans. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes that's just how a new species will arise, because it might be a thriving individual, but it might not be able to mate with a different individual unless they also have the same set of chromosomes. Yeah, that's one of the ways those work. And again, I'm giving you a lot of information, but for the exam, you just need to know when we're talking about sympatric speciation, we're saying this one species is turning into two species and they're in the same place. Unlike allopatric speciation, where that one species turned into multiple species because they were separated from each other. Physically, geographically separated from each other. But I will give you a textbook example, your textbook, on the next slide. Even though, again, you don't need to know that much detail, I'm still going to give you some more information. So any questions about this slide? All right. So there's these two different fish. They used to be the same species. The thin-lipped cichlid. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. I've never heard of this example until I read your textbook. But the thin-lipped cichlid or the thick-lipped cichlid. If I'm saying that correctly. I'm going to read you what it says because, again, I had never heard of this example. Your textbook says, these fish are from a lake in Nicaragua, and they show evidence of sympatric speciation. The lake is a crater lake. It is 1,800 years old, which means it's really young. I know that doesn't sound young, but as far as geological time is concerned and biology is concerned, life's been around 4 billion years. 1,800 years is very short. Anyway, let's see. It's 1,800 years old, but genetic evidence indicates that the lake was populated by only 100 years ago by a single population of these fish. So that's even younger, right? So even though it's 1,800 years old, which is not very old for a lake, it also has only had this species for 100 years. Nevertheless, two populations with distinct morphologies and diets now exist in the lake, and scientists believe these populations may be in early stage of speciation. There you go. So it's a new study, I guess. Technically, if I'm reading your textbook correctly, they're not a new species yet. They're just they're hypothesizing that they're working on it, right? There's differences, but they can still mate, so they're not different species yet. I will point out too. I don't know if I was sitting in your spot right now when someone was teaching me this, I would ask them like, "How is that St. Patrick?" I assume that one of these is like in maybe the shallow part of the lake that has different nutrients and different temperatures and different sunlight and different predators. And one's in a different part of the lake, maybe it's deeper. Again, different temperatures, different oxygen content, different predators, different environments, right? So I guess they're calling it St. Patrick because they're in the same lake. But in my opinion, they're in different environments, probably. Because lakes, a crater lake, a big deep crater lake, probably has a lot of different ecosystems within it. So I don't know. I wish I could. I might write them actually. I'm curious. Like, are we really considering that St. Patrick just because they're in the same lake? Anyway, again, that's just an example. St. Patrick, speciation happening when they're geographically together. Allopatrick, speciation happening when they're not geologically together. Geographically, geologically, whatever, excuse me. Anyway, so are there any questions about that? All right, so now that we know about this diversity of life, let's explain the diversity of life, right? Well, and again, this is from the old textbook, and I love that the old textbook does this in so many chapters. It's not the first time you've seen this. They kind of give it as a story. Like, here's the story of how we got to know what we know. And as always, I'll remind you, this is not a history class, so I'm not going to be asking you a lot of this information I'm giving to you, but I do like giving it to you as a story. So the explanation of the origin of the diversity of life is basically part of the evolutionary theory, right? This is where it comes from. And this was proposed by Charles Darwin. Even that, I'm probably not going to ask you. I don't think I might have any questions with his name in it, or where I ask you about his name. There'll probably be some questions that mention him, but it won't be about him. Or this, for that matter. I think it's important for the history of science, but it's not history class. But when he proposed it, he did it in this book, On the Origins of Species by Means of Natural Selection. It was published in 1859. And again, you don't need to know the name of the book. You don't need to know when it was published, but we're giving you that information anyway. But anyway, before we talk about what he did, we're going to back it up and tell you what we used to know and what we used to think, and then how we got to what we know now, what Darwin figured out. So first, we're talking about the idea of fixed species. The old textbook mentioned Aristotle. Your textbook mentions Plato. Neither one of those names are names you're going to need to know for the exam, but we'll talk about this anyway. These very smart people, right, probably the smartest of their time and still some of the smartest of all time, they thought that species were fixed permanent forms that did not change over time. So they looked out at the world, and whatever they saw, they thought, all right, that's the way that thing has always been and always will be, and there's never been extinctions, right? So they look at the world and all the creatures they see, all the life they see, they figure has always been there. And there's never been any other life, just what they see. And again, that life they see now has never changed. It's always been the way they look now. Of course, we know now that's not true, but that was their thoughts, right? And then about sort of the same time, the Bible comes in, and the Judeo-Christian culture reinforces the same idea. If you literally interpret Genesis, it'll tell you basically, this is the way things are, right? God created life, or God created the earth, created everything on it, and that's the way it is, if you take it literally. Now, if you download the PowerPoint, you can click on that little bust of Aristotle, and there's a little video about his idea or the Greek idea of Greek fixed permanent forms. And then you can also click on the Bible, and it'll give you their idea of how life began. But of course, again, I'm not going to test you on any of this, just letting you know how we got to where we are now. In the 1600s, religious scholars estimated the Earth was 6,000 years old, right? So that's about the point where religious scholars estimated that. So it wasn't scientists, it wasn't geologists. Those were just the best experts at the time, because they have the Bible, right, which was an old book that says this is how it happened. And they figured, yeah, it's 1,600 years old. Again, now we know that's much older than 6,000 years old. But we'll cross that bridge later. So the idea that all living species came into being relatively recently and unchanging dominated for centuries. And today still, that is a dominating idea, right? I know plenty of people in my own life who believe that everything they see has always been this way and it hasn't changed and it won't change. And that, this is just the way life is. But even though this idea did dominate for centuries and still, again, dominates today in certain parts of society, there were still naturalists that were grappling with these ideas of fossils, right? So if they're finding these fossils, the fossils aren't a new thing. Well, obviously, by definition, they're not new. But humans having access to fossils is not a new thing, right? So there was these people who had discovered these fossils, and it just didn't make sense to them. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you, but a fossil is an imprint or a remain of an organism that lived in the past. Once we're done talking about this, we're actually going to come back and talk a little bit more about fossils. Like when we talk about evidence of evolution, I'm sure you guys know what a fossil is. So anyway, they're looking at these fossils, and it just doesn't jive with everybody believes. Like, okay, the world's only 1,300 years old. 6,000 years old. Nothing's changed. There's been no extinctions. So what are these things? And here's a great example. And I don't remember if this is in your textbook or not. It's definitely in the old textbook. But they have these things they used to call snake stones, right? And they were looked to them like coiled bodies of snakes, but they never found one with a head on it. And they thought, what in the world? That is so weird. How does this make sense? Because, that was coincidental. But of course, it turns out later, people figured out it's because they're not snakes. They're a whole different species. They were mollusks. Obviously didn't have heads like a snake would. But anyway, that's just an example too. I'm not going to ask any questions about it on the exam. Here's a bigger example or a discovery. In the 1800s, they found this, the ichthyosaur, right? They could clearly tell this was like a hybrid between a lizard and a fish, right? A reptile and a fish. And there was nothing on Earth living like it. So at that point, people really started having to say, well, okay, obviously things have changed. They may not have had the word evolved yet, but life has not always been the way it is now. And there have been extinctions, right? This is when they started to realize this, because what if, when you look at that fossil, what else are you going to think? Clearly, that is nothing like they've ever seen on Earth. Anyway, if you download the PowerPoint, if you click on that little fossil, it'll be a little video that briefly talks about the ichthyosaur. Again, just an example. I'm not going to ask you about the ichthyosaur. Certainly not going to ask you that discovery took place in the 1800s. So for that reason, I will keep moving on to catch up. Let's talk about Lamarck and the evolutionary adaptation. So, a lot of people give Darwin credit for, I don't want to say discovering evolution. He's the first to propose it. That's what he gets credit for. But it turns out he was not the first to propose it. There's this guy named Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And I will ask you a question about him. Not necessarily about him, but about his theory. So here in a second, we'll talk about his theory. But he suggested the best explanation for these fossils that we're talking about, right? These fossils that are confusing naturalists. He had an explanation. His explanation was that life evolves, right? So again, he was basically the first person credited for saying life evolves. And hopefully, again, given the information I've just presented to you, you can see why and how he came to that. Right? Clearly, life is not the way that they thought it was, not unchanging. There have been extinctions. But again, this is just an introduction. Nothing on this slide will be on the exam, so I'm going to move forward. Let's talk about what he proposed. So again, keep in mind, he was correct. Life does evolve. But his problem was his proposal, and that's what we're going to talk about. He proposed that evolution is a refinement of traits that equip an organisms to perform successfully in their environments. I'm not going to ask you to regurgitate that information, but you need to know it. And I will give you an example. Because he said by using or not using body parts, an individual may develop certain traits that passes on to its offspring. And I'm going to use giraffes as an example. It's not in writing on my pictures of it. Just imagine it, right? So he thought, well, giraffes, they got their longer neck because they spent their days stretching to get those high leaves, right? The leaves that most other animals couldn't get to and eat. It was stretching them. And obviously the ones that did a better job of stretching, those are the ones that are going to be fed, therefore survive, therefore reproduce, right? But that's not how it works, right? It's not because they were stretching, and they were stretching, but it's not as if stretching your neck leads to your kids, your offspring having also a slightly stretched neck, and then they stretch their neck their whole life, and then their offspring have slightly larger necks, right? That's not how it works, but that's what he thought. And of course, at the time, that's not an unreasonable thought. They certainly didn't know anything about genetics. But yeah, so for the exam, that's what's going to happen. Again, I'm not going to ask you to regurgitate this first bullet point, but I may say something like, so-and-so proposed that, and I won't use a giraffe as an example, but I'll give some example like a giraffe, and you should be like, oh yeah, that would be Lamarck. So, yeah. Anyway, again, his idea of how species evolved was mistaken. His proposal that species evolved as a result of interactions between organisms and the environment, though, did help set the stage for Darwin. So again, he wasn't far off, especially using the giraffes as an example, right? So they did, well, I'm going to tell you officially in the next few slides, what actually happened was there was variation. All these giraffes, some were slightly taller and had slightly longer necks. So they probably had slightly more food, so they were slightly healthier and had a slight advantage, a survival advantage, therefore a slight advantage for reproduction. And over many, many generations, those genes got passed along, and we ended up with long necks for giraffes. Anyway, any questions? All right. Let's talk about Charles Darwin and the origin of species. And again, this is based on the old textbook. They're giving it as a story, and I prefer to do it that way, even though I'm not going to be asking questions about the story. Let's talk about Charles Darwin. He was born in 1809 on the same day as Abraham Lincoln. This little trivia for you. If you ever get on Jeopardy, maybe that'll help you. But don't need to know for the exam. He was fascinated with nature as a boy. So, this wasn't just new things. It's not like one day he's like, yeah, I guess for a job, I'm going to figure out evolution. Right? He's always been fascinated as a boy. What I found interesting, though, was that, not good there yet, sorry. He was in school to become a doctor, but he quit that. He found it boring and disgusting, basically. Think about it. We're talking in the 1800s. Surgery was probably pretty horrific by then. You weren't putting people to sleep. You were just sawing off legs as they're screaming and things like that, right? So he quit. And this is where it gets interesting to me. When he quit medicine, he went into religion. He studied to be a clergyman. And I love this because this shows it's not like, a lot of people are against, very religious people would be against some of the things that Charles Darwin said. And I like this because it isn't as if Charles Darwin didn't know religion, right? He knew religion. He studied for it. But the ideas he came up with did go against, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, a literal interpretation of some of the Bible. So anyway, he studied to be a clergyman. That didn't stick. So at the age of 22, he began a voyage on a boat called the HMS Beagle, and that helped him frame his theory of evolution. That last bullet point is what we're going to talk about here for a while. We're going to talk about his journey and how he came up with all these ideas. But again, nothing on this slide is going to be on the exam. It's just an introduction. I'd like to tell them the story. I wish I could do that with all the stuff we teach. If you download the PowerPoint, you can click that picture of the HMS Beagle, and then it'll be a short video that talks about his journey on that trip. Anyway, let's talk about his journey. Again, a lot of information that's just leading up to what you need to know. I'm going to go through this quickly because I'm not going to ask you this stuff on the exam. But the Beagle was a survey ship, meaning it was going out there and looking at new land so they could make charts, make maps. We didn't have GPS back then. We didn't have satellites, so that's what you had to do. I don't know why I wrote that. I need to fix that. I said that he was charting the South American coast. He was, or the Beagle was charting the South American coast, but it was also charting, mapping other stuff too. But that's neither here nor there. That's not important for your exam. So they're on a boat, right? They're going from all over the world, really. But right now we're talking about South America. So obviously they didn't stay on the boat the whole time. They got off and explored. When he was on shore, that was exactly what he did. He explored. He collected fossils. He also collected living, or well, I won't say living, but extant species, right? So it might be a dead species, or a dead animal, but a living, it was alive a day ago or whatever. So he collected samples. It's that little star for it. Your book specifically describes his observations of ground finches, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. So yeah, as you're studying this, like I said, your textbook, the new one, talks about ground finches. But just so you know, that's just an example. So you can read about it all you want, but I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. So yeah, again, he's exploring. He's collecting specimens. He's collecting fossils. He's collecting notes, right? He's keeping detailed journals of what he sees. And think about it, he probably did a great job with that. Like, what else are you going to do? You know, it's the 1800s. You're in some uncharted place in South America. You're not watching YouTube. You know, you're not playing your Switch. Not going to the local bar and hanging out at the beach. Right? None of that existed. So this is what he was doing. Anyway, I'm going to move forward because, again, there's no questions about this on the exam, so it's relatively unimportant. These are the different ground finches. Again, I feel like you should read about it, but I'm not going to waste your time talking about it. But basically, what he figured out was, you know, these finches had different beaks, and he figured out basically that's because they ate different things. So he basically hypothesized that, hey, we had this one finch, one ancestor finch that went into different areas, right? Allopatric speciation, and these different areas had different food sources, and those different food sources had, you know, different types of beaks would be beneficial to eat those different types of food sources. So that's what he figured out. Read about it all you want. It is a great example, but there'll be no specific test questions about that. Here's a picture from the old textbook. Again, like I said, he wasn't always in South America. They went to other places too. One of the things I find slightly interesting, not that you need to know this either, but it's more trivia for you. Darwin, Australia is up here in the Northern Territory, which I find funny because he never went there. He went to the southern part of Australia. So I don't know what that's about. Anyway, speaking of which, Australia will be the next word for attendance. Australia. Have you guys ever been? Anyway, again, this is just an example. It's not very important. What is slightly important is the Galapagos Islands. We're going to talk about them here shortly. But even though they are important to this story, there's not going to be many questions. I'm certainly not going to ask you to know any of the names of the Galapagos Islands. But before we even get there, I will point out, like you can see, even just by looking, you can see we have different size islands, right? Even just knowing that, just because they're different sizes, you can imagine they have different life on them, right? Because bigger islands are one environment, smaller islands are different. So you would have different environments. And the idea that we have different environments will be very important coming up. As a matter of fact, we can even just backtrack a little bit and talk about those ground finches, right? So if a ground finch is living on one island and that island has a certain type of food versus living on another island that has a different type of food, then a different beak will give you an advantage or a disadvantage. Anyway, we'll come back to the Galapagos Islands. That will be important a little bit later. Let's talk about his observations. His observations indicated that geographic proximity is a better predictor of relationships among organisms and similarity of environment. I'll read this example, and then maybe I'll give you another example if I needed to. But plants and animals living in temperate regions of South America were more closely resembled to species living in tropical regions of South America than species living in similarly temperate regions of Europe. That's a lot of words. So what I'm saying there is, like, when I say temperate, that's kind of like where we live, right? We live in a temperate area. West Virginia is temperate. You can think of a lot of Europe would be temperate, the UK, things like that. So what he's saying is he's looking at these plants and animals in this temperate area of South America, and they're completely different than anything he's seen back in the UK, right? Though they have very similar environments, they're still completely different. Then he's comparing these species he's seeing in this temperate area of South Carolina, of South America, which again reminded him a lot of home, the climate. He's comparing those species to the species he's seen in the tropical areas of South America. And somehow, even though those are vastly different environments, those species seem to be more related. And again, that's how we figured out this part right here, right? Geographic proximity is a better predictor of relationship among organisms. So that goes back to that the radiation we were talking about, radiation, but where the species had started at one place, right, and migrated out And that was still an example of allopatric speciation, but that's what this was, right? These species started somewhere in South America and this spread out. And as they found these different environments, they changed and they evolved. And so at some points, they evolved to new species. But I guess the most important thing on this slide, as far as the exam is concerned, is that. Just that right there. Geographic proximity is a better predictor of relationship among organisms than similarity of environment. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right, the South American fossils he found, though clearly examples of different species from living ones, were distinctly South American in resemblance to living plants and animals of that continent. So I have a bunch of pictures. You probably could look at these and probably guess what these animals are. But the funny thing is, you would probably be wrong because these are actually based off of old fossils. So even though that may look like a capybara, it's not. It was an older extinct version of a capybara. You know, llamas, jaguars, toucans. Those are all extinct species, actually, that just happen to look a lot like the ones that are alive today. Again, just giving you the story. This isn't important for the exam. Darwin was intrigued by the distribution of organisms on the Galapagos Islands. Again, I told you we'd come back to that, and that's what we're doing now. Let's talk about why the Galapagos Islands are so important to this story. First of all, they're relatively young. Like the volcanic islands, meaning there used to be nothing but water, and volcanoes happened, and eventually it built up, and now we have an island, right? So they are less than, so that part's, let me pause for a second. That's the first important part. So they haven't always been there, meaning life, you know, when those islands first formed, there was no real life on there. Obviously, the bacteria and things like that, but, you know, there was no land plants, land animals, right? It was just a rock that had come out of the ocean. So it was new. The other thing is this distance. Now, I'm going to ask you about the distance on the exam, but this distance is important. It's about 540 miles away from the mainland. And the reason that's important for this young island that had no real life on it yet is because it was close enough to the mainland where occasionally life from the mainland wouldn't make it to the islands, right? If you had a good storm, you know, blowing things off South American coast, and maybe it survived, maybe some birds made it and survived, right? Coconuts, for example, right? Coconuts are gigantic seeds that float on water. That was far enough away where sometimes, or close enough to the mainland where sometimes you can make it. Other seeds, maybe animals that fell on a raft of palm fronds or whatever, right? So it's close enough where it could happen. But it's important, though, that it's far enough away where it didn't happen often, right? So it's close enough to where we could get life on those islands, but far enough away where we don't have a lot of influx coming in from the mainland, right? So whatever made it there was essentially isolated, right? There wasn't much coming in after that. And then those things that made it there usually weren't going back to the mainland, right? So in a sense, this is like saying we have this relatively young islands with relatively new life on there, right? That came from South America, right? These species came from there, but then they essentially got separated. Allopatric speciation is what happened. So on the Galapagos Islands, most animals he found are found nowhere else in the world, right? So, and I still want to go there. That's on my bucket list. If you go to the Galapagos Islands, you will see things there that you won't see anywhere else. But despite that, they resemble South American species. So even though you can tell they're completely different, you can also tell that they must have come from the South American mainland. And again, even though we're going to talk about it in more detail, just think it's allopatric speciation. You have one species, well, obviously you had hundreds. Just consider like this one species of bird, for example, it's on South America. A few of them make it to the Galapagos Islands, and they got lucky to get there, so they're not leaving. And again, when that first happened, that's the same species, the same one they had in South America too. But since they're now on the Galapagos Islands and dealing with a different environment, and they're not breeding with the ones on the mainland, they're doing their own thing. Eventually, all those changes are going to build up, and you're going to have a different species. Any questions about this slide? And again, to remind you, I'm not going to ask you how far the thing is from the mainland. The idea is just important because that allowed us to basically that location provided the allopatric speciation that we talked about earlier. Here's some examples. I'm not going to ask you about these examples, but the marine iguanas and the turtles. So he noticed that the marine iguanas had flattened tails that aided in swimming, and they were similar to, but distinct from land-dwelling iguanas on South American land. So again, I used that example earlier. Like maybe a regular old iguana, like I don't know if you've ever seen one, but a regular iguana maybe fell on a log or something that could float. It got stuck out in the middle of the ocean, but eventually swept, they got swept out to the islands and made it. And again, since they're on islands, they're not like living in the jungles of the mainland, so they eventually adapted to living in the water instead of in the trees. So again, they could tell that this came from the regular iguanas, but they are completely different now because of their environment. And then the tortoises are a good example too. Each island has a distinct species of tortoise, and you can tell by the shape of their shell. It's not that you need to know that. And also, this should make sense too when you think about it. No matter where you go on the Galapagos Islands, whichever island you go to, it's the same species of marine iguana because they're all the same. But the tortoise, again, from one island to the other, you're going to have a different species of tortoise, and that makes sense. This thing, that kind of animal, it's just going to swim from island to island. So it's not, that species is not necessarily separated from the rest. They're just swimming from island to island. There is no allopatric speciation there. These tortoises, those big old things, they're not going to swim from island to island. So they are separated from each other, even though those islands are close. These things aren't swimming from island to island. Anyway, just an example. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this little video about marine iguanas. You can watch this little video about the Galapagos tortoises. Here's a picture of one. That one has a dome shell. If I was an expert on these things, I could say, oh yeah, that was from this island, but I don't know. Here's one with a saddleback shell, again, from a different island. And some more trivia for you. Darwin had an island. He took one of these things home. He got one of those big tortoises and took it back to England, and he had it his whole life. And I don't know if you guys know about tortoises, but they live to be really, really old. So I don't know where that tortoise was in the in-between time, but sometime after Charles Darwin died, eventually, I don't know if you guys know who Steve Irwin was. Steve Irwin got the tortoise, the same tortoise. So I don't know. Again, that guy died, late 90s, early 2000s, maybe? So yeah, that tortoise lived a long time. Anyway, let's move forward with the less than 4 minutes left to go in this discussion. So those were his observations. Let's start talking about his new insights. So again, on his voyage, we already talked about some of the stuff he was doing, right? He was getting offshore, he was exploring, he was taking specimens, he was taking detailed notes. But another thing he was doing was he read this book called Principles of Geology by this guy named Charles Lyell. There'll be no questions about him. If you download the PowerPoint, you click on that, watch a little video about him. And this guy proposed that Earth was ancient, right? So again, this is still that time when a lot of people were still thinking the Earth was only 6,000 years old. And people were starting to come around to the idea that it was a lot older than that. This is one of the people who was pushing that idea, right? Ancient Earth. He said the Earth was sculpted over millions of years by gradual geological processes that continue today, right? So Darwin's reading this book. He's understanding that. The Darwin himself witnessed the power of nature when he saw earthquakes, amongst other things. There was one point where he saw an earthquake, right? The earthquake happened. A couple minutes later, like he saw that the coastline, like maybe a rock, had risen a meter. Like think about that. It's here one day, it's here 1 second, and then 3 feet taller the next second. So he figures, all right, if I can see this much change in front of my eyes, then you can imagine how much change Earth would see over millions of years, right? So bringing all this together, he began to doubt that the Earth and its organisms had been created a few thousand years earlier. So again, we all know that Charles Darwin came up with the idea of evolution by natural selection. But as far as where we are in this story, he hasn't gotten there, right? He's still just on this journey. He's taking notes. He's making observations. He's reading. To go back to chapter 1, when we're talking about the scientific method, he's still in the first part, right? That observation / exploration. That's exactly where we are in the scientific method here. And then here, in a sense, that's the second step of the scientific method. Remember, after observations comes questions. So he started to question things. Upon his arrival or return to England, he reflected on all those observations. He analyzed his specimen collection. He was rereading all those notes that he took. He's talking to people. He's discussing his work with his colleagues. Again, this is just a story. I like to tell it this way, but I might ask you questions about what he did when he got back to England. But eventually, you know, after, and it wasn't right away. It's not like he just said, you know, hey, I got it now. It was years, right? But after years, he eventually concluded the present day species are descendants of ancient ancestors, which they still resemble in some ways. So that was what he finally came up with. And again, it wasn't right away. And over time, those differences gradually accumulated by a process he called descent with modification. And that was the word he used to describe evolution. He didn't use the word evolution. That's the word he used, the term he used, descent with modification. And again, some of that's not necessarily new. Remember, we talked about talked about De Lamarck. So this isn't exactly new, but this part is. He also proposed a mechanism for how life evolves, and he called it natural selection. So he was the first person to figure out natural selection, or at least the first person to talk about it. And even though I'm going to define natural selection in many ways in the next week, here's one of them. Individuals with certain inherited traits are more likely to survive and therefore reproduce than other individuals with other traits, right? So that's the one definition for natural selection. And we only have a second left, so that's where we will end it. Don't forget to send the emails with the words. Don't forget to ask one question about material. If you're watching online, make sure well, it's too late now to get the screenshots, but you should have the screenshots. So make sure to include those. And if you're watching the video, make sure you like or comment on it, take a screenshot of that, and send that in too. That's it. I will see you all on Wednesday or in office hours if you need me. Hope you have a great week.